What would be more terrifying? Seeing a reflection in the mirror that wasn't yours, or seeing no reflection at all? When I was 12, my parents sent me to spend the summer with my great-uncle Jeremy. Back then, I was a bit of a troublemaker, and they thought that staying with him might teach me some discipline. You can imagine how annoyed I was when they told me about their plan. I rolled my eyes so hard, thinking it would be the worst summer of my life. Little did I know, it would actually be far worse than anything I had imagined. Uncle Jeremy was a mountain man. He lived deep in the wilderness of Montana, surrounded by thick pine trees. He was one of those old-school homesteaders who made his life off the land, which most people today couldn't handle. To me, at that time, he seemed a little crazy, but that wasn't what scared me. My dad barely slowed the car down when he dropped me off. I barely had time to grab my bag before Dad sped away, leaving me in front of my uncle's cabin. I felt a little insulted by how quickly my dad had abandoned me, but I didn't envy his long drive back down the rough dirt road. It had taken us almost 2 hours to get there, and his little Prius struggled the whole way. I was sure at one point we'd get stuck, but somehow we made it. Once Dad's car disappeared into the forest, I turned to face the cabin. It wasn't the cozy log cabin you see in pictures. It was rough. The wood was faded and worn from years of harsh weather, hot Montana summers and freezing winters. Everything looked old, like it had been pulled straight out of the forest surrounding it. There weren't any power lines, satellite dishes, or anything that looked remotely modern. I knew then that this summer was going to be even more boring than I'd thought. As I raised my hand to knock on the door, I noticed something odd. Deep scratch marks all over the door. Bears? I wondered, feeling uneasy. I got the sudden feeling that something was watching me from the trees. I glanced over at the tree line, half expecting to see something there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling me into the woods. But just then, the cabin door creaked open, pulling my attention back. Standing in the doorway was Uncle Jeremy. He was an old man with a long, tangled grey beard and skin that looked as worn out as the cabin. His eyes were cloudy and grey, and he stared at me like he hadn't seen another person in years. I'd never met him before, but I'd heard stories from my dad, who had spent a summer with Uncle Jeremy when he was my age. "You better listen to your Uncle Jeremy," my dad had warned me before dropping me off. "He's not someone you want to get on the wrong side of." But as I stood there looking at him, Uncle Jeremy didn't seem so scary. He almost looked kind, though rough around the edges. "Hi, I'm Marcus," I said, sticking out my hand to shake his. Instead of shaking it, he slapped my hand away and covered my mouth with his own hand. "Shh, no names here," he whispered urgently, glancing over his shoulder like he was afraid someone, or something, was listening. This was my first sign that Uncle Jeremy might not be all there. My dad had mentioned that he was a little strange, but this was something else. He hurried me inside the cabin, still whispering. As he shut the door behind me, I thought I heard him say my name, but when I looked at him, his face was filled with fear. I realized the sound of my name had come from outside, carried on the wind. My skin crawled, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Is everything okay, Uncle Jeremy?" I asked, but before I could finish, he slapped me across the face. "I told you, kid, no names," he said angrily, his eyes darting back to the tree line outside. Then, almost like a dream, I heard it again. This time, a faint voice drifted into the cabin. "Jeremy," it called softly. "What the hell was that?" I asked, but Uncle Jeremy didn't answer. He quickly slammed the door shut and turned to me with a serious look. "Rule number 1, no names," he said, scolding me. I stared at the floor, feeling embarrassed. "Rule number 2, if you hear something strange, leave it be. Just ignore it. Do you hear me?" He seemed so serious that I didn't know whether to laugh or argue. "Why?" I asked. "Don't ask questions. Just follow the rules, or I'll send you back to Boise right now. You hear me?" In that moment, I got an idea. I realized that if I broke his weird rules, he might actually send me home early. I tried not to grin at the thought of escaping this place. "Your room's down the hall," Uncle Jeremy said, pointing to a small hallway. He led me to a tiny room, barely big enough for a bed and a dresser. I dropped my backpack onto the bed and sat down with a sigh. "What do you think this is? Some fancy mountain vacation?" Uncle Jeremy asked, noticing my disappointment. I glanced at the crumbling wooden walls and thought to myself, the understatement of the century. "We've got work to do," he said, moving to the window and opening the shutters. Outside, there was a small clearing surrounded by trees. Chickens wandered around, and I saw a couple of goats and a cow grazing near a small garden. "We work for our food here," Uncle Jeremy said, with the first real smile I'd seen from him. He opened a drawer in the nightstand and pulled out a pair of old, torn overalls. "These are for you. Put them on and meet me outside." I spent the rest of that day doing chores with Uncle Jeremy. We weeded the garden, fed the chickens, and milked the cow, Bessie. By the end of the day, I was sore and exhausted. Uncle Jeremy wasn't kidding about the hard work. He said we'd be doing the same thing again tomorrow. That night, as I lay in bed, every muscle in my body ached. I buried my face in the pillow, hoping I'd wake up back home in Boise. But just as I started to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from outside. At first it was faint, like the sound of mice scurrying in the walls, but these walls were solid wood, not hollow. I lifted my head from the pillow and listened more closely. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was rhythmic, like something was scratching in a pattern. It grew louder, turning into a high-pitched screech that reminded me of nails on a chalkboard. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and heard a whisper, my name. "Marcus," it hissed. I turned toward the window and saw the shutters slowly opening on their own. "Uncle Jeremy!" I yelled. From down the hall I heard him burst out of his room. He charged into mine, rifle in hand. His eyes met mine, then darted to the window, where the shutters were still creeping open. He slammed them shut and locked them tight before turning to me, furious. "Kid, you broke both of my rules on the first night," he shouted. I stared at him, confused and scared, not understanding what was going on. "Now it knows our names," he said, almost whispering. "You have no idea how hard it was to get rid of the last one." His words made no sense to me. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Never mind," he snapped. "Just keep these shutters locked from now on, and remember, if you hear me calling your name, it's not me." The next morning, after breakfast, Uncle Jeremy and I went outside to check the side of the cabin where the scratching had come from. He wore a gun belt with a Magnum revolver holstered at his side. When we reached the wall, my heart sank. There, carved into the wood, was a strange symbol, a circle with 3 jagged lines slashed through it. Above the circle were 2 names, Jeremy and Marcus. "He'll be back tonight," Uncle Jeremy said with a nervous chuckle. As we stood there, Bessie, the cow, let out a loud, agonizing moo. Something was wrong. Uncle Jeremy walked over to her, and when he knelt down beside her, I saw the terrible sight that still haunts me today. Her udders were mutilated, torn open, with blood and milk oozing out, attracting flies. "Poor Bessie," Uncle Jeremy said sadly. He stood up, pulled out his revolver, and without hesitation shot Bessie in the head. The gunshot echoed through the clearing, and every bird in the forest took flight. That night, we barricaded ourselves inside the cabin with the animals. I held a rifle, but Uncle Jeremy told me not to use it unless something happened to him. The night was quiet, too quiet. The goats huddled under the table, and the chickens roosted uneasily. Then all at once the animals erupted in panic. The scratching started again, louder this time, followed by banging on the door. Then I heard it, my own voice calling out to Uncle Jeremy. "Jeremy! Jeremy, Jeremy," it said. Then it changed to Uncle Jeremy's voice. "Marcus, open the door, Marcus." Uncle Jeremy fired his gun through the door, and the banging stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then, cautiously, Uncle Jeremy went to the door and began unlocking the latches. My heart was racing. I wanted to shout for him to stop, but I was frozen in fear. As he cracked the door open, he peeked outside. His face went pale, and I will never forget the words he said next. "Oh shit." Suddenly, a long, clawed hand reached through the crack in the door, grabbed Uncle Jeremy, and yanked him outside. I heard a horrible scream. but I couldn't tell if it was from Uncle Jeremy or the creature. Everything went quiet after that, except for the thumping of my heartbeat in my ears. Then I heard Uncle Jeremy's voice again. "It's okay, kid. I got him." His voice was shaky, and I couldn't see him clearly through the door. But as the door creaked open, I realized something was wrong. It wasn't Uncle Jeremy standing there. It was the creature that had taken him. It was tall, skinny, and its pale skin was stretched tightly over its bones. Worst of all, its face was blank. It didn't have eyes, a nose, or a mouth. But as it turned toward me, a mouth began to form, slowly peeling open with sticky, gum-like flesh. Sharp, jagged teeth emerged as it smiled. In Uncle Jeremy's voice, it called out one last time, "Marcus." The creature lunged toward me, and just as it was about to reach me, a gunshot rang out. The creature fell to the floor, oozing green blood. Standing in the doorway was Uncle Jeremy, bloodied and limping, but alive. After that night, I had no problem following Uncle Jeremy's rules. For the rest of the summer, we worked the homestead in silence. I never mentioned his name again, and I certainly never broke any of his rules. Even though I saw things moving in the trees every now and then, I ignored them. I wanted nothing more than to get through the summer and leave that place behind. 10 years later, I found out Uncle Jeremy had died. My father said it was a bear attack, but I wasn't so sure. My mind went back to that summer and the faceless creature that had scratched at the cabin walls. A day before I left for his funeral, I received a letter in the mail. It had been sent from Uncle Jeremy's P.O. box. I assumed it was something he had left for me, but when I opened the envelope, there was only a single piece of paper. Drawn in blood was the same strange symbol we had found carved into the cabin wall that summer, the circle with 3 jagged lines. Above it were 2 names, Jeremy and Marcus. Only this time, Uncle Jeremy's name was crossed out. As I stared at the letter in disbelief, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from outside my house in Idaho. Somehow it had found me again. When I got the call that my father had died, I decided to drive across the country to his funeral. I wasn't really close to my dad, and I wasn't going for closure. No, I was going because my mum told me I wouldn't get my inheritance unless I showed up. I didn't want to see my family, but I could really use the money. My plan was simple: drive there, attend the funeral, get out as soon as possible. I was driving through the middle of nowhere in Iowa when my car started acting up. My Chevy began to sputter, and the engine light blinked on. I cursed under my breath, turned on the hazard lights and coasted to the side of the road. The car gave one final sad cough and shut off completely. I grabbed my phone to check for service, but of course there wasn't any. I hadn't seen another car or sign of life for miles. I remembered passing a rundown gas station a few miles back, and since walking there seemed like my only option, I decided to give it a try. "Damn it," I muttered, stepping out of the car. The road was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy. The wind blew through the cornfields, carrying a strong, earthy smell. I locked my car and started walking. I reached the gas station just as the sun was setting. I was tired, sweaty, and thirsty. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The rusty sign above the pump said, "Harper's Fuel and Goods." A neon open sign flickered weakly in the window, buzzing as if it might go out at any second. I pushed the door open, and a small bell jingled. The inside was just as old as the outside. Shelves were lined with dusty cans, bottles of water, and a few bags of chips. Behind the counter sat an old man, as thin as a scarecrow, with skin that looked worn by years of hard work. His eyes were distant, like he'd been waiting for someone for a long time. "Car trouble, I take it," he rasped. "Yeah, broke down a couple miles up the road. No service either," I replied, trying to sound casual, though something about the place felt off. It looked like the setting for one of those horror movies where the characters end up being chased by maniacs. The old man nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on mine. "Ain't much for signal out here. Nearest town's quite a ways off." "Yeah, I figured," I said, glancing around the dusty store. "Do you know of any motels nearby, or maybe someone who could tow my car?" A slow, thin smile spread across his face. Well, I ain't a tow truck driver, but I reckon I can help. I live just up the road. Got some tools at the farm. You can stay the night, and in the morning we'll see about fixing your car. I hesitated. The idea of going with a stranger set off alarm bells in my head, but what other choice did I have? My legs were already aching from the walk, and there was no way I could make it back to my car in the dark. Finally, I nodded. All right, thanks. I appreciate it. The man's truck was old and rusted, making a loud rumble as we drove down the dirt road. Cornfields stretched endlessly on both sides of us, and the setting sun cast long shadows across the stalks. After a while, the farm came into view, a white, worn-down house with a few barns and a silo. It looked like it hadn't changed in decades. The paint was peeling, and the porch looked like it might collapse at any moment, but it was better than being stranded on the road. As we pulled up, the porch light flickered on, and I saw them, his family, an older woman, 2 adults, and 2 kids stood perfectly still on the porch, watching the truck approach. We got out of the truck, and the man pointed to them. That there's my wife, Sue, and our kids, John and Mary, and their little ones, Billy and Ruth. He introduced them in a strange way, but I brushed it off as I stood there awkwardly. Nice to meet you all. Thanks for letting me stay, I said, forcing a smile. Kid here has some car troubles. Told him he could stay the night with us, the man told Sue. There was something odd about their faces, like they weren't fully there, but I smiled anyway. Sue smiled back, wiping her hands on her apron. You must be hungry. Supper's almost ready. You're welcome to join us, she said. Thanks, I replied, shaking her hand. Her grip was strong and her hands were rough, probably from years of working on the farm. John and Mary, the 2 younger adults, stood by the door, watching me without saying a word. Their faces were blank, their eyes never blinking. It made me feel uncomfortable. The kids, Billy and Ruth, were even stranger. Their faces looked off, crooked eyes, wide, gapped smiles, and their heads seemed too big for their small bodies. They clung to Sue's dress, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Frank led me inside, not giving me much time to dwell on how odd his family seemed. The house was dimly lit, with faded wallpaper and old wooden furniture. The smell of cooked meat filled the air, but underneath that was a musty odor, like mold. It made me feel uneasy. We sat around a long table, and Sue began serving plates of food, slabs of dark, tough meat and watery mashed potatoes. The food didn't look appealing, but I didn't want to be rude, so I picked up my fork. So, where you headed? Frank asked, breaking the silence. To a funeral, I replied. In Ohio, I'm just passing through. Sue clucked her tongue sympathetically. That's a long way. You'll need your strength for a trip like that. I nodded and took a small bite. The meat was tough and stringy with a metallic taste. I forced it down, trying not to gag. You don't talk much, do you? Frank asked, grinning. Oh, sorry, just tired, I muttered, glancing around the table. The kids were still staring at me with those wide, creepy eyes, their heads bobbing as they chewed their food. The longer I sat there, the more uncomfortable I felt. The house seemed to close in on me, the air thick and heavy. The food sat in my stomach like a rock. Well, you'll sleep good tonight. Ain't nothing but peace and quiet out here, Frank said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The bedroom they gave me was small, with a sagging bed and a window overlooking the cornfields. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the wallpaper was peeling in places. I sat on the bed, which creaked under my weight, trying to shake off the unease I felt. As I lay down, exhaustion started to take over. The house was quiet, and I told myself I'd be out of there first thing in the morning. That's when I heard it, a door creaking open down the hall. I froze, listening as slow footsteps moved through the house. My heart pounded in my chest. I got up quietly and moved to the window, peeking through the curtains. Outside, I saw Frank and his family walking in a line toward the barn. The 2 younger children, Billy and Ruth, followed behind, their heads bobbing in that strange way. There was something eerie, almost ritualistic, about the way they moved. I watched as they entered the barn one by one. My instincts screamed at me to stay put, but curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what they were doing. I slipped out of the room, moving quietly down the stairs and out the front door. The night air was cold as I crept toward the barn, my heart racing. The smell of earth and decay filled the air, growing stronger the closer I got. The barn doors were slightly open, and I peered inside. What I saw froze me in place. The family stood in a circle around a wooden altar, each wearing a cow's head, real, rotting cow heads. The flesh was decaying, and the eyes were hollow, just black pits. They wore robes made from cowhide, and the smell of rot was overwhelming. But what terrified me most was the creature standing in the center. It was massive, a twisted fusion of man and cow. Its legs were bent and ended in hooves, but its torso was human, covered in matted fur. Its arms were long, ending in sharp black nails. And its head, it was part human, part cow, with horns sticking out of a misshapen skull. One side looked almost human, with a bulging eye and a crooked mouth full of jagged teeth. The other side was more cow-like, with a long snout and a milky, oozing eye. A crown made of sticks sat on top of its head. It let out a low, guttural noise, a mix of a moo and a scream. Frank dropped to his knees, holding up a bowl of thick red liquid. He muttered something I couldn't understand, and the creature leaned down, lapping at the liquid with a long, black tongue. "Our king, tonight we bring you an offering," John and Mary said together. I felt sick. I backed away from the barn, my heart pounding. I had to get out of there. I backed away from the barn, my heart racing, trying to control my ragged breaths. I wanted to run, but I was terrified that any sound would alert them. I couldn't let them know I had seen whatever this was. I needed to get away quietly. Just as I took another step back, the creature's milky eye rolled in its socket, and for a split second, it seemed to lock onto me. Its lips twisted into something that resembled a smile, revealing more of its sharp, yellowed teeth. My stomach dropped. It had seen me. Without thinking, I turned and bolted, no longer caring if I made noise. I sprinted back toward the house, the sound of my footsteps thudding on the dirt. My mind screamed at me to keep running, but I could hear the barn doors creak open behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran as fast as I could, the cold night air stinging my lungs. The fields on either side of me seemed to stretch forever. My only thought was to get to the truck and get out of this nightmare. I could hear the family's footsteps and distant shouts behind me. Getting closer, I was running out of time. I finally reached the truck and yanked the door open, praying the keys were still inside. To my relief, they were. My hands shook uncontrollably as I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life just as I saw the family running toward me from the shadows. I didn't wait to see what they would do. I floored the gas pedal, and the truck lurched forward, tires spinning as dirt kicked up behind me. The old engine roared as I sped down the road, my heart still pounding in my chest. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but all I could see was the dark outline of the barn and the cornfields fading into the night. I didn't stop driving. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get as far away as possible. The eerie images of the family, the creature, the ritual, they all played over and over in my mind, and no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the sick feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. Eventually, I reached a small diner on the edge of a town. The lights in the parking lot felt like a sanctuary, a piece of reality pulling me out of the nightmare. I pulled the truck into the lot, parked, and sat in silence, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had just happened. My hands were still trembling, my mind racing. I never made it to my father's funeral. After witnessing something so horrifying and twisted, the idea of an inheritance, of money, seemed so unimportant. I didn't care about the reason I had started this journey anymore. I just wanted to put as much distance as I could between me and that farm. Every night since then, I've been haunted by what I saw in that barn. I dream of the creature, its twisted, rotting face, and its cold, milky eye. In my nightmares, I can never outrun it. No matter how far I go, it always finds me, always drags me back to that barn. And I'll never set foot in Iowa again. I don't know when you'll read this, but I can tell you when everything started. I was out for a walk in the woods, alone, when it came for me, it wasn't just a blur or something I could see. It was, in the strangest way, like a void. Where it hid, there were no trees. Where it moved closer, there was no grass. When it jumped at me, there wasn't even a breeze. There wasn't any air at all. When it hit me, I felt claws dig into me, somewhere deep inside, somewhere I didn't even know existed. My arms, legs, and body were fine, and I wasn't bleeding, but I knew something had changed. I felt injured, but not in a way I could see. Scared, I ran home, but I knew something was missing from me. I felt a little tired, and my mind was foggy. At first, the fix was easy. I drank a big cup of coffee and it helped me feel normal again. For a while, that strange, draining feeling just became part of my day. I drank coffee and everything seemed fine. That was also the week I met Ma. She and I hit it off immediately, and to be honest, I think I fell in love with her over the phone before we even met in person. It seemed like the strong emotions I was feeling stirred the entity. It wasn't gone. It was still attached to some hidden part of me. The first signs were small, and I didn't think much of them. One morning, my neighbor's car went from dark blue to black. I stared at it for a moment, confused, but then shrugged it off. 2 days later at work, a co-worker's name changed from Fred to Dan. I asked around carefully, but everyone swore his name had always been Dan. I figured I'd just made a mistake. But then something happened that was impossible to ignore. I was in my bathroom peeing when suddenly I was standing on a random street. I was still in my pajamas, pants down, urinating in front of a dozen people waiting for a bus. Horrified, I pulled my pants up and ran before someone could call the cops. I somehow made it back home, but that experience forced me to accept the truth. Something was still very wrong. The entity was doing something to me, and I had no idea how to stop it. That evening, Ma showed up at my place, but this time she had her own key. "Hey," I asked her, confused, "how did you get a key?" She laughed. "You're so cute. Are you sure you're okay with this?" She walked into a room full of boxes. I know moving in together is a big step, especially since we've only been dating for 3 months. Moving in together? I'd only met her the week before, but I knew better than to make a scene. Instead of freaking out, I played along, telling her everything was fine. Then I quietly went to my room to figure things out. Everything in my room looked just as I'd left it, with no sign of 3 months passing. Then I checked the date, and my heart sank. The entity had stolen 3 months of my life. What was this thing? What kind of creature could take pieces of my life like that? I had missed the most exciting part of a new relationship. I'd never know the stories or jokes from those 3 months. Something precious had been taken from me, and I was furious. That anger helped me keep the entity at bay. I didn't drink alcohol, only coffee. I checked the date every morning when I woke up. For 3 years, I managed to live each day without any major problems. There were still small changes. A neighbor's job, how many kids someone had, the layout of nearby streets, but I never let myself lose focus. But one day, I made a mistake. I got really into the season finale of my favorite TV show. The story was intense, and I was totally caught up in it. Suddenly, a little boy came up to me and shook my arm. "Who are you?" I asked, surprised. "How did you get in here?" The boy laughed. "Silly daddy." My heart dropped. I knew right away what had happened. After asking a few careful questions, I found out that he was my son. He was 2 years old, and I had no memory of his birth or his early years. I was devastated. Not only had I missed the birth of my own child, but I had also missed 2 whole years of his life. I didn't know what moments I had shared with him, or what milestones I had missed. Ma and I had apparently gotten married and started a family during the time I'd lost. My chest ached with the weight of what had been stolen from me. It was snowing outside. I held my son in my lap, watching the snowflakes fall, wondering how I was supposed to live like this. If losing focus for a moment could cost me years, what kind of life was I facing? I needed help. I went to a church, but the priests didn't believe me. They said I had health problems, not spiritual ones. Doctors didn't know what to do either. They ran tests and took my money, but they couldn't find anything wrong with me. Out of options, I decided to tell Ma. I had no idea what my life looked like from her perspective. Was I still doing my job? Was I still taking care of our son? She didn't seem to notice anything was wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing in her life when I wasn't truly there. I planned a nice dinner to tell her the truth, but when she knocked on the door that night, she was dressed up, looking excited. "A fancy dinner for our second date? I knew you were sweet on me," she said with a smile. I was stunned. This was only our second date. I quickly realized that this was another time jump, but I kept calm. If I had talked about being married and having a son, she would have thought I was crazy. Instead, I took her coat and enjoyed the dinner. Through some careful questions, I figured out that we really were only on our second date. This gave me hope. The entity wasn't eating entire chunks of my life. It was more like my soul was shattered, and I was living my life out of order. I could still experience everything, just not in the right sequence. For a while, things went on like that. Minor changes happened daily, but big shifts in time only occurred every few months. Whenever I found myself in a new time, I stayed quiet, observing everything before making a move. I learned to adapt. One day, I met my 6-year-old grandson, and I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. "A writer," he said. I told him that was a great idea. Then, I jumped back to my early days with Ma. We had an amazing night by the riverfront, and I asked her to move in with me. I got to live through what I had missed the first time. I realized that I was never truly absent. I was always there, just in a different order. Ma even told me one day that it felt like I loved her as if I'd known her for a lifetime. She was right. I had. For a while, I felt at peace with my strange life, but then things started to get worse again. The entity hadn't left me. It was digging deeper into my mind, breaking me into smaller and smaller pieces. The time between shifts became shorter, first months, then weeks, and then days. I feared that soon I would be jumping every second, never able to hold a conversation or even recognize the people around me. One day I found myself much older, watching the snow fall outside. The snow had always calmed me, kept me present, but then a teenager touched my arm. "Grandpa?" he asked. I turned, startled. "Who are you?" He smiled, unsure if I was joking. "It's my first attempt at a novel. Will you read it?" It was my grandson. I told him I would read it and sat down to focus. As I read, I saw Ma moving around the house. I needed to finish the story before I jumped again. After I was done, I called my grandson back. "It's terrible," I said honestly, "but it's terrible for the right reasons. You're young, but the story's structure is solid." I paused. I didn't expect it to be a horror story. He nodded. "It's a reflection of the times." I had an idea. "Do you know much about strange creatures?" He lit up. "I love that stuff. Why?" I told him about my fragmented life, about the entity that had been with me all these years. He listened carefully. "We should start keeping track," he said. "Write down everything. Maybe we can figure out a pattern." I was surprised by his seriousness. "How will we do that?" "Leave your notes somewhere hidden," he suggested. "I'll collect them and try to find a pattern." We decided on a spot under the stairs. He went to check, and when he came back, he was holding a box full of papers. "Holy crap," he exclaimed. "You already did it." I blinked in surprise. "I did?" He nodded. "Yeah, you've been leaving notes for a while. There are 50 boxes down there." It hit me then. I had already been doing this for years, but out of order. My grandson smiled at me. "I'll figure it out, Grandpa. I'll save you, Grandpa, because I don't think anyone else can." Tears filled my eyes as I realized how lonely I'd been. My grandson was the first person who truly understood what I'd been going through. I hadn't realized how desperate I was for someone to believe me. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you so much." Before I could say anything else, the world shifted again. Suddenly I was younger and back at work on a random Tuesday. The sadness of leaving my grandson was still with me, but a new determination had taken hold. After finishing my work for the day, I grabbed a notebook and began writing everything down. I didn't want to forget anything again. I would write every detail of my life, every jump in time, so my grandson could piece it all together. As the days passed, I filled box after box with notes. I started hiding them under the stairs, just like we'd agreed. I wrote about each jump, where I was, what had changed, and who I was with. The time between jumps became shorter and shorter. Soon, I was shifting every few hours, then every few minutes. My life was becoming more and more fragmented, but I kept writing. I couldn't let the entity win. I couldn't let it erase me entirely. One day, I found myself sitting in a chair, much older than I'd ever been. I looked around and saw my grandson, now a man in his 30s, standing beside me. "Come on," he said, excitement in his voice. "I think I've finally figured it out." I was weak, my body frail with age. "Are you him? Are you my grandson?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Yes," he replied, helping me to my feet. He led me to a room filled with strange equipment. In front of me stood a large mirror, twice the height of a man. "I've been working on this for decades. I finally found a way to help you." "How long have you been doing this?" I asked, my heart sinking. I didn't want him to waste his life trying to fix mine. His face was hard, determined. "It's worth it. I had to save you." He handed me a device with 2 metal rods and nodded toward the mirror. "This will reveal the creature that's been haunting you." I looked into the mirror, and for the first time I saw it. The creature that had been stealing pieces of my life appeared above my head. It looked like a leech, with a gaping mouth latched onto my skull. Its slimy body wrapped around my shoulder and disappeared into my very soul. The sight made my stomach turn. This thing had been feeding on my mind for years. My grandson stood beside me, watching the creature's reflection in the mirror. "Removing it is going to hurt. A lot, but I think we can get it off you." I was terrified, but I couldn't live like this anymore. "Do it," I said. He began hooking up wires and electrodes to my body. "This device will send an electric shock through your nervous system," he explained. "It's calibrated to make you unappetizing to the parasite." As he finished setting everything up, I had one last question. "Is Ma still here?" I asked, my voice cracking with emotion. His face softened. "No, Grandpa. She passed away a few years ago." I felt a wave of grief wash over me. I didn't need to ask how. I had already lived through her death in one of my jumps. The memory was too painful to relive. "Then do it," I said, my voice thick with sadness. "I don't care if it hurts or if I die. I don't want to live in a time where she's not alive." My grandson nodded, understanding the weight of my words. He flipped the switch, and the electric shock hit me hard. At first it didn't hurt much, just a little jolt, but then the pain started to build. It was like fire spreading through my entire body, burning every nerve. I could see the creature in the mirror, writhing in agony as the shock waves passed through it. It dug its claws into me, trying to stay latched on. Memories began flooding my mind. I saw Ma's smile, bright and warm, as we sat together by the fire while snow fell outside. That memory was crystal clear now. I hadn't lost it after all. But then, another memory surfaced. I was holding her hand in a hospital room, watching her die. The pain of that moment hit me like a freight train. I had never wanted to relive it, but now I had no choice. The memories I had missed, the ones the entity had hidden from me, were rushing back all at once. The shock intensified, and I screamed as my body convulsed in the chair. The pain was unbearable, but I knew it was working. The creature was loosening its grip. Through the haze of pain, I could see flashes of all the moments I had missed. The birth of my son, the first steps of my grandson, the laughter, the tears. It was all coming back to me. But with it came the realization of how much I had truly lost. Finally, with one last jolt, the creature released me. It hissed and slithered away, disappearing into the void from which it had come. I collapsed in the chair, gasping for breath. I felt weak, but also free. My grandson helped me up, his face full of concern. "You did it," he said softly. "It's gone." I looked at him, tears in my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. But the relief was short-lived. As I stood there, I realized that Ma was really gone. The creature may have been feeding on my mind, but time itself had stolen her from me. I looked out the window at the snow falling gently outside, the same snow I had watched with Ma all those years ago. The world felt both familiar and different now. I had my memories back, but the future was still uncertain. The phone rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. I knew who it was before I even picked it up. It was Ma. This was the moment she had first called me, long before the entity had ever come into my life. With a bittersweet smile, I picked up the phone. "Hey, who's this?" I asked, knowing the answer, but happy to live through it all again, even if just for a little while longer. Every night, no matter the weather, something walks down our street, softly whistling. You can only hear it if you're in the living room or kitchen when it passes by, and it always happens at exactly 3:03 a.m. The sound starts off faint, somewhere near the beginning of the street by the Carson place. We live closer to the middle of the street, so the whistling moves past us before fading away in the direction of the cul-de-sac. When I was younger, my sister and I would sneak into the kitchen sometimes to listen. Our parents didn't like that. We'd get in trouble if they caught us, but they were never too hard on us as long as we followed the one big rule. Never ever try to see who or what is whistling. The neighborhood I live in is a pretty strange place. I've lived here since I was 6 years old, and I really love it. The houses are small but well kept, the yards are a good size, and there are plenty of places to explore. I'm 13 now, and I've grown up with lots of kids my age. We used to play foursquare in the cul-de-sac, or wander from one backyard to the next during the summer. It's a great place to grow up. But there are two odd things about this place: the night whistling and the good luck. The whistling never bothered me much. Like I said, you can't hear it from my bedroom. But my mum and dad don't like talking about it, so I stopped asking questions. My dad is a strong guy, tall, calm, and has an accent from growing up in the islands. My grandparents are from there too. The only time my dad isn't calm is when the whistling comes up. When he talks about it, he speaks a little quicker, his eyes move faster, and he tells us not to think about it too much. He always reminds us of the one big rule: don't try to look outside when the whistler walks by. Not that we could look, even if we wanted to. Every window in our house has heavy canvas shutters that roll down from the top and latch at the bottom. Each latch has a small lock, like the kind you'd find on a diary. Every night, my dad locks those shutters and keeps the key in his room. I'm not sure what my mum thinks about the whistling. Sometimes I've seen her sitting in the living room when it happens, though not often. I'd sneak a peek by cracking my bedroom door open just a little. Every once in a while, she sits there quietly on the big red couch, just listening. The whistler always has the same cheerful tune. Da-da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-da-dum. Remember I mentioned two strange things? Well, besides the whistling, everyone in our neighborhood is really lucky. It's hard to explain, and my dad doesn't like us talking about this part much either, but good things just seem to happen to people around here. Usually it's small stuff: winning a radio contest, getting a promotion at work, or finding something cool like old arrowheads buried in the yard. It's like the weather is always nice, there's no crime, and everyone's gardens bloom beautifully in the fall. My mum calls it a million little blessings. But the main reason we moved here, and the reason we stay, is my sister Nola. She was born very sick. There was something wrong with her lungs, and we couldn't bring her home after she was born. She had to stay in the hospital. I remember how small she was, even compared to the other babies. She was hooked up to machines that helped her breathe. We moved into this house to be closer to the hospital, and that's when Nola started getting better. The doctors couldn't explain it. They thought it was something they were doing, but we all knew they were just as confused as we were. My parents, and even I, knew that Nola getting better was just one of those little blessings that came with living here. That's why we stayed, even after we learned that for every small blessing, sometimes bad things happen too. But those bad things only happen if you break the big rule and look for the whistler. When we first moved in, the neighborhood's welcoming committee came by. They were very friendly. They brought a macaroni casserole, a gift basket, and a manila folder. 4 people came to our house, and they all made small talk with my parents. They gave me a Snickers bar and took turns holding Nola, who had just come home from the hospital. Then they asked to speak to my parents privately. I was sent to my room, but I still managed to overhear almost everything. The welcoming committee explained how nice the neighborhood was, how it was a wonderful place to live. Then they told my parents about the whistling that happens every night at 3:03 a.m. They warned them that the whistling would never hurt us, as long as we never tried to look at what was making the sound. This part they really stressed. I pressed my ear harder against the door to hear better. The committee explained that people who went looking for the whistler would have their luck change, sometimes in terrible ways. A dark cloud would follow anyone who broke the rule. Anything that could go wrong would. The manila folder they brought contained newspaper clippings about car accidents, ruined lives, public tragedies, and strange deaths. Not everyone dies, the head of the committee told my dad, but those who live are never the same. They lose something. It's like the light inside them goes out. I could tell my mom wasn't taking it seriously. She kept asking if this was some kind of prank they played on new neighbors. At one point she got mad and accused them of trying to scare us, or even being racist, since my dad is from the islands. But my dad calmed her down. He said he believed our new neighbors were just trying to help. He told my mom he'd heard stories like this growing up, and he knew strange things walk among us. Some are good, some are bad, but most are just different. After the committee left, my dad went to the hardware store, bought the canvas blinds, latches and locks, and installed them on every window in the house. That first night, I sneaked out of my room around 3 a.m. I found my dad sitting on the couch in the living room, holding Nola. He saw me, smiled, and held his finger to his lips to tell me to be quiet. Then he patted the couch, motioning for me to sit with him. I sat down, and we waited. At exactly 3:03 we heard the whistling. Da-da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-da-dum. Just like our neighbors said, it came and went. The whistling passes every night, and we never try to look. We enjoy our million little blessings, and Nola grows stronger every day. My dad eventually joined the welcoming committee. Whenever new neighbors move in, he takes them a casserole, a gift basket, and the manila folder. I can tell by the look on his face when he gets back if the new family took the committee's advice seriously, or if we'll be getting new neighbors soon. Not too long ago, a family moved in right next door. The previous owner, Ms. Maddie, had passed away at age 105 after living a long, good life. The new family seemed nice enough. They believed the welcoming committee's story, took my dad's advice about the blinds, and everything went smoothly for the first month. Then one night, when the new neighbors had to leave town, they sent their son, Holden, to stay with us. Holden was 12, a year younger than me. We didn't know him well, but I had a bad feeling as soon as his parents left. "Do you know who's out there whistling every night?" Holden asked as soon as the adults were gone. We were sitting in the den with a Disney movie playing in the background. My sister Nola and I exchanged a glance. "We don't talk about that," I said. "I think it's that weird guy who lives in the big yellow house on the corner," Holden said. "You mean Mr. Tolles? No way. He's really nice," my sister replied. Holden shrugged. "Well, if it's not him, maybe it's a psycho killer." Nola tensed up. "We don't talk about it," I repeated. "Let's go play Nintendo in my room." We spent the next few hours playing games, eating popcorn, and watching movies. It was a typical sleepover, but I could tell Holden was getting restless. After my parents came to wish us good night and locked the blinds, Holden stood up from his beanbag and walked over to me and Nola, who were sitting on my bed. "Have you ever tried looking?" he asked. "It's almost time." Like most sleepovers, we had ignored any bedtime suggestions. I was surprised to realize it was nearly 3 a.m. "I told you, we don't..." "I can't look even if I wanted to because my dad locks the blinds every night and hides the key," Holden interrupted. "So does ours," said Nola. Holden grinned. "No, he doesn't." "You saw him do it," I said, a little sharper than I meant. Holden's grin got even bigger. "Yeah, he locks the blinds, but he doesn't hide the key. He keeps it on his regular keychain." "So?" I asked, already feeling a sinking feeling in my stomach. I had a bad idea of what Holden was going to say next, and I didn't like where this was heading. I knew my dad didn't bother hiding the key anymore. After all these years, he trusted that we wouldn't break the big rule. We took it seriously. So, after your dad locked the blinds and before your parents went to bed, I went to the bathroom. Holden continued, clearly enjoying the suspense. And on my way back, I may have peeked into their room and saw your dad's keychain on his nightstand. Then I maybe went in and borrowed the key to the blinds. Nola and I stared at him, shocked. He was smiling like he'd just pulled off a clever prank. "You're lying," I said, but I already knew he wasn't. Holden shrugged. "You can go check for yourself. Just open your parents' door and look. You'll see the keychain right there." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to march right into my parents' room and prove Holden wrong, but if he was telling the truth, I didn't want to imagine what might happen if the blinds were unlocked and the whistler was about to pass by. What if we broke the big rule? "Stay here," I told him, my voice tense. "Don't move a muscle." I hurried out of my room and down the hall to my parents' bedroom. I stopped at the door, feeling nervous. If Holden was right, and my dad left the key out in the open, then the window blinds might be at risk. But if Holden was lying, I'd be waking my parents up for nothing, and they'd be furious. I gently pushed the door open, just a crack, and peeked inside. It was dark, too dark to see much of anything. I took a deep breath and stepped into the room. I froze. Just as I entered, I heard it, the soft, familiar tune of the whistling. It started faintly, coming from the far end of the street, but it was growing louder. For the first time, I realized my parents had been hearing this every night, just like we had. They had never said a word about it to us. The sound sent a chill down my spine, and I stood there in the dark, completely still, listening as the whistling grew closer and closer. I panicked. "Nola!" I yelled, sprinting out of my parents' room and back toward the den. When I got there, Holden was standing by the front window, and Nola was right beside him, her small frame hunched over in fear, but with just enough curiosity to stay close to him. Holden had the key in his hand, and I heard a soft click. My heart stopped. He had unlocked the blinds. "Holden, don't!" I shouted, but it was too late. With a quick, reckless motion, Holden pulled the blind down. I heard the unmistakable sound of the blind snapping up, releasing the window's view. The whistling was right outside our house now. For a split second, everything felt suspended in time. My eyes locked onto Nola, and without thinking, I dashed forward. I grabbed her and yanked her away from the window, spinning her so she faced the opposite direction. At the same time, I squeezed my own eyes shut, blocking out the sight of whatever was standing on the other side of the glass. The whistling stopped. I could feel Nola shaking in my arms. She was trembling so hard I could feel her little heart racing against my chest. "Don't look," I whispered to her. "Don't turn around. Just keep your eyes closed." She nodded, her head buried in my shoulder. I reached out blindly with my free hand, feeling for Holden. My hand touched his arm. He was shaking too, worse than Nola. "Holden?" I called softly, but there was no response. I extended my hand further, feeling along the cold glass of the window. The closer I got to the window, the colder it became. So cold it felt unnatural for the time of year. My fingers brushed the string to the blind. Carefully, trying not to think about what might be standing outside, I grabbed the string and yanked it, pulling the blind shut with a loud snap. The moment the blind closed, I opened my eyes. The room was dimly lit by the light from the kitchen, casting long shadows across Holden's pale, horrified face. He was standing completely still, staring at the closed blind, his eyes wide with fear. "Holden?" I asked again, more urgently this time. He turned slowly to look at me, his face ghostly white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then, without warning, he let out a blood-curdling scream. The sound of his scream sent the whole house into chaos. Lights flicked on in the hallway, and I heard my parents' heavy footsteps rushing across the floor toward us. Nola was still clinging to me, sobbing quietly into my shoulder, but my attention was glued to Holden, who stood frozen in place, his face twisted in terror. Holden had wet himself. His lip was bleeding from where he had bitten down so hard, and tears streamed down his face. "What happened?" My dad's voice was sharp, and I could hear the panic in it. He was standing right behind me. I turned, still holding Nola, and looked at my dad. He looked. I'd never seen my dad scared before, not like this. His face went pale, and his eyes widened in a way that made my stomach twist. This wasn't just fear. It was the kind of deep, bone-chilling terror you only see when someone realizes they're in serious danger. "Just Holden," he mouthed to me. I nodded. My dad exhaled, his body sagging with relief. He almost looked happy for a split second, knowing Nola and I hadn't looked. But then his face hardened again, and he turned to Holden. There was a knock at the door. We all froze. Holden whimpered in fear. "Don't answer it," my mum whispered. She was standing in the hallway, her face pale and drawn. I had always thought she didn't believe in the whistling, that she humored my dad with the locks and shutters. But in that moment, we were all believers. The knock came again, louder this time. "Please don't open the door," Holden whimpered, his voice barely a whisper. My dad walked over to Holden and wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close. "We won't," he said quietly. "Nothing's coming in here tonight." Thud, thud, thud. This time, the knock was loud enough to rattle the door on its hinges. Holden screamed again, and Nola clutched me tighter. My mum crouched beside us, wrapping her arms around Nola and me. Thud, thud, thud. "Call the police," my mum whispered to my dad. The knocking stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. My dad turned to look at us, confusion on his face. "Do you think—" He didn't get to finish his sentence. A frantic knocking started again, this time softer, like polite taps. "Police!" said a voice from the other side of the door. The voice sounded like my mum's. "Police! Call the police!" It repeated the words in a strange parrot-like way, as if mimicking what my mum had said. "Police! Call the police!" Tap, tap, tap. "Police!" My mum tightened her hold on us. "Please stop," she whispered. "I don't think calling them will help," my dad said quietly, his voice tense. "How would we even know it's really them at the door?" The knocking returned, louder this time, shaking the front door. Then, from the back of the house, I heard another knock. It was coming from the back door. We all turned toward the sound, but the knocking came back to the front door almost instantly. It was like something, or someone, was knocking at both doors at the same time, switching back and forth. The knocking grew more frantic, pounding on the doors, the walls, and even the windows. It was as if something was trying to tear the house apart from the outside. "Stop!" Holden screamed, his voice breaking. The knocking ceased. Holden sobbed quietly. "I won't tell. I promise I won't tell anyone what I saw. Just please go away." For a long, terrifying minute we sat in silence. Then we heard it again. A soft tap, tap, tap at the window Holden had opened. Holden broke down into deep, guttural sobs, shaking uncontrollably. He cried like someone who knew they were doomed. My dad held him tightly, stroking his hair but not making any promises. He didn't lie and tell Holden that everything would be okay. He couldn't. We all knew better. The tapping continued at the window for the rest of the night. We huddled together in the living room for hours. At one point, my mum tried to take us to my room, thinking we could sleep there. But the second we moved, the knocking returned, even louder. It was like the house itself was under siege. We hurried back to the living room, and the knocking stopped again. Only the tapping at the window remained. None of us slept. The tapping finally stopped at 7 a.m., just as the sun began to rise. We waited for another 2 hours before my dad cautiously opened one of the blinds. He made sure we were all safely in our parents' bedroom before he did it. We waited, listening to the quiet, holding our breaths. After what felt like forever, he came back in. "It's done," he said, looking exhausted. The tapping had stopped, and the strange knocking was gone. It was finally safe. Holden's parents came to pick him up around lunchtime. My mum and dad walked him back to his house, and they were gone for a long time. Nola and I watched from the window as they talked. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Holden's parents looked just as pale and shaken as Holden had. They kept glancing nervously at the house, at the windows. It was obvious that they were terrified. When my parents came back, they didn't say much. They wouldn't tell us what they'd discussed with Holden's family. It was a Sunday, so we spent the rest of the day together, ordering pizza, watching movies, trying to act like everything was normal, but none of us could shake what had happened the night before. That night, my family didn't sleep in separate rooms. We all stayed in my bedroom, my mum and Nola in the bed with me, my dad in a chair he had pulled in from the living room. There were no knocks or taps that night. The house was quiet, eerily so. Holden and his family stayed for the rest of the week, but we didn't see them much after that. They kept to themselves, and by Thursday, a moving truck was parked in their driveway. Nola and I watched as they packed up their things and left. What sticks with me most is the look on their faces. Holden and his parents looked so tired, their faces drained of color. Their mouths were tight, their eyes empty and distant, like they had seen something they could never unsee. Even from across the street, I could tell something was deeply wrong with them. Whatever they had seen that night had changed them. They were gone before sunset. As I watched them leave, I thought back to what the original welcoming committee had said to my parents when we first moved in. Not everyone who looks at the Whistler dies, but even if they live, something goes out of them. Their lives become a series of little tragedies, one after another. I think Holden's parents must have looked. Maybe they did it to comfort him, or maybe they didn't believe at first and wanted to see for themselves. Either way, they broke the big rule, and now they had to live with the consequences. Sometimes I watch Nola, happy and full of life, and I wonder, if I had been slower that night, if she had looked out the window, would I have looked too? Would I have been able to resist the urge to share the burden with her? I'm grateful I never had to find out. We still live in the same house in the same neighborhood. We still hear the Whistler walking past every night at 3:03. The blessings and good luck that come with living here are too good to leave behind, but we're more cautious now. We don't have sleepovers with friends anymore, and my dad hides the key to the blinds very well. Not that I go looking for it. Some things I've learned you just don't need to see. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.